Hello everybody, welcome to another video, and today we're going to be talking about the 2024 general election. And the reason why I want to talk about this election is because of its importance for the war in Ukraine and for American foreign policy as a whole. So while I talk about it, I do want to open up Biden's transcript for his State of the Union address, which he gave last night. In this photo, you could see Biden shaking hands with the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, which is something we'll talk about later. But here is the transcript for that speech. And the reason why I'm even showing it is because he does mention Vladimir Putin. He talks about the Russia Ukraine war. And so it does have some relevance. Now, when we look at the 2024 election, there are differing foreign policy perspectives for Biden and Trump, respectively. When we look at Biden, he has consistently been in support of strengthening NATO. Now we have the admittance of Sweden and Finland into the alliance. And more generally, he has been supportive of the American aid for Ukraine. Now, on the Republican side, Trump has been much more skeptical of NATO. He has really had a pointed criticism of NATO regarding America's overrepresentation when it comes to spending money on defense. And he believes that NATO countries are not paying their fair share. He believes that they should all be paying at least 2% of their GDP towards annual defense spending. And that when they don't do that, the United States is forced to foot the bill. And he is very skeptical of America's role in doing so. And so he's not necessarily completely opposed to NATO, as there is a mechanism by which he could perhaps become more friendly towards NATO if the amount of spending that European nations put into the alliance generally increased. But you could see the difference between him and Biden, who is not really mentioning that European spending issue. Now, within the Trump camp and within the dissident right, there is a rising amount of people within the base, but also within the media sphere, who are much more skeptical of Ukraine aid and of involvement in foreign conflicts in general. And that includes people like Donald Trump's own son, Donald Trump Jr., former presidential candidates, and perhaps a potential vice presidential candidate for Donald Trump, Vivek Ramaswamy. And you have a whole host of conservative media figures that regularly interact with Donald Trump on social media. And so that definitely does play a role in Trump's opinions and could play a role in his decision making if he were to be elected president. And so something very interesting that happened in December of 2023 is that Congress passed the National Defense Authorization Act, which totals $866 billion in new defense spending. And within that bill, there was a provision that would bar the president of the United States from unilaterally withdrawing from NATO. And that is likely being passed, or the reason why it was even written is due to fears that Trump could perhaps, if he were elected, withdraw from NATO. And so now the new provision states that in order to leave NATO, it would have to be with Senate approval or through a bill that would be passed through the House and the Senate alike. In regards to Ukraine aid, Biden has been a staunch supporter. He has seen the passing of $74.3 billion in total aid, and in particular $46.3 billion in military aid. And now Biden also wants to pass $95 billion in a new emergency bill, which will include $60 billion to Ukraine, including $14 billion to purchase weapons and equipment from American firms. And this is also why congressional elections are so important, because currently that bill that was passed through the Senate is being stalled in the House due to the Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson, not wanting to put it up for a floor vote. And so it has not been able to really pass through the congressional mechanisms for nearly a month, and that is stalling the Ukraine aid. And so this also has a lot of implications for the 2024 election, because there will be House elections and Senate elections. And so that could potentially change the makeup of Congress, which could change the way in which the body actually votes if they were given the opportunity on such important legislation. Now, when it comes to Trump, he has been much more skeptical of aid to Ukraine. He has supported a negotiated settlement in the conflict with Russia. He opposes the most recent $95 billion aid package and says more generally that foreign aid should only be provided as a loan with strings attached. And as I said before, his inner circle, his media ecosphere has really been skeptical of continued support for Ukraine and has really supported negotiations between Russia and Ukraine. And so that definitely plays a role in his thinking. And so with that out of the way, let's actually look at what the polling data says about the state of the electorate as of March 8th, 2024. And so this is totally subject to change over the coming months when this video will probably be obsolete, especially now that Biden is likely ramping up his campaign operations. There may be a slight change in the polling in favor of Biden. Maybe the election will narrow up in terms of the popular vote margins and in some of these states. Because right now, Donald Trump does have a commanding lead in a lot of key swing states. And even in the popular vote, which he lost even in 2016 when he beat Hillary Clinton, he does have an advantage. And so we're going to go through each state and see where they're currently at. Let's begin by looking at the safe states for Donald Trump, which are states that voted for or that will vote for Trump by over 15%. And in many of these states, there is not actually any polling data. And so I'm just going to go off of previous elections, which is the second best information or piece of data that we have. And so we're just going to go through some of these safe Donald Trump states, which include Idaho, Wyoming, Montana, both Dakotas, Nebraska's at large, and both the first and third districts, Oklahoma, Arkansas, Louisiana, Mississippi, Alabama, Tennessee, Kentucky, Missouri, Indiana, West Virginia, and South Carolina, leaving him with 110 electoral votes. In the Biden camp, we have California, Hawaii, DC, Maryland, Rhode Island, or Massachusetts. Here we actually have Maryland, Delaware, New Jersey, and Vermont. And so you can see there are some pretty interesting omissions, such as Connecticut and New York. Both of these are likely Democrat states based on the current polling data. And when I say likely, it means that it's within a margin of 5 to 15%. And so currently, both of them are pretty close to being safe states, but they are still on the margins and considered to be likely states based on the polling data averages from the website 538, which compiles all of these polls. And I just got an average of them. And now these are the results. Now, there are a few other states here that are traditionally Biden states or Democrat states that I have marked as likely based on the polling averages, and that includes Illinois and Washington, which voted or will vote for Biden per the polling averages by 13.3%, and then Oregon, which Biden has a lead in of 12.5%. Now, looking at Trump's likely states, so some of these states are traditionally considered to be solid Republican states, but in recent elections they have narrowed down, or the polling data is simply too early on. And when the polling data is several months or even a year out in some cases, when we're looking at these averages, they are usually more inaccurate. They tend to be more dynamic. You usually have more voters who are unsure about who they're going to vote for. And so that is reflected in some of these results. So, for instance, Kansas is a likely state, which does make sense because it was a likely state in the 2020 election, voting by about 14% for Donald Trump. So, again, it is solid Trump, but it is only in the likely margin. Utah, Trump leads here by 10%, so it is in the likely margin. And Alaska, Trump leads here by 8.75%, putting it in the likely margin. And in recent years, we've seen the vote margin for Republicans in Alaska significantly reduce, not just on a national level, but also in congressional elections or in local elections. So there is a shift for Democrats in the states. Same thing with Utah, while Donald Trump has been running on the national ballots. Looking at some of the likely states for both sides, we have Maine's first congressional district, which is usually considered safe Democrats, but right now is in the likely column for Joe Biden. Looking at Iowa, it is actually a safe state where Trump leads currently by 15%, which is a very significant number. If we look at the 2020 election, Trump only won here by around 8%, which is, again, a very good number for Iowa, which was considered previously to be a lean Democrat state in the Obama years, and then gradually turned more and more towards a more toss-up sort of states. Now Trump is taking a commanding lead over here, and you can see that in the trends where Trump won here by 10% in 2016, and now the polling data shows him leading by 15 points. And looking at Texas, over here, Trump leads by 7.1%, which is pretty similar to some of the results from 2020. And given a lot of the projections by pundits several years ago that Texas would get closer and closer, and that in 2024 it could be a swing state, that the Democrats could perhaps win, it is a good showing for the Republicans that they have been able to maintain the 40 electoral votes in the state as reflected in the polling data. In Ohio, Trump currently leads by 8.8%. If we look at the previous elections, Trump won by pretty similar margin in 2016 in Ohio, and since then he's also maintained a pretty similar number in 2020. And again, Republicans have been improving their numbers in local elections and also in congressional elections. So Donald Trump has largely been responsible for this shift, where we've seen a lot of blue collar workers or generally rural workers or rural voters within the state and states that are around it turning towards the Republican Party in a number that would be enough to shift the vote by a pretty significant amount, turning it away from a toss up to a likely Republican state. And there has been a similar phenomenon occurring in the other Rust Belt states that we'll get to later on in the video, although those states are still considerably closer. Looking at Colorado, Biden currently leads here by 6.5%, putting it as likely Democrats. This is a state that has shifted significantly towards the Democrats over the past two election seasons. We can look at the previous elections to verify this, where it was only a +5 Hillary Clinton states, and we go to 2020, and it's already +13. So there has been a sizable shift. In the current polling data, it is a bit closer, but it will probably shift more towards Biden as we get closer to voting day. In New Mexico, Biden leads by 8 points, which is again 8% likely margin, which is pretty similar to what we've seen in previous elections. More generally, over the past 20 years, New Mexico has shifted towards the Democrat side. This again has a lot to do with demographic shifts in the state, where we now have a Hispanic majority, if not a plurality. I'm not sure, but either way, the voter base over here is voting more and more for Democrats. But in this current polling data, it's not that significant of a lead compared to other election races. In New Hampshire, Biden currently leads by 6.7%. And again, New Hampshire was previously considered to be one of the closest races. For instance, in 2016, it was very close between Clinton and Trump. Trump only lost by several thousand votes. In 2020, though, Biden won by a pretty large margin. And that is also reflected in the current polling data for 2024, where he leads by a likely margin of 6.7%. And one more state where he leads by a likely margin is Minnesota. Minnesota has recently gotten closer due to Trump's general increase in support in these Rust Belt states by blue collar workers, and that has slightly reduced the margins in a state like Minnesota. Especially in 2016, it was a pretty close state, but in 2020, Biden did increase the Democrats' momentum, and he won it by 7%. And now the margins have slightly decreased, but it is still a likely margin. And just as a brief correction, what I meant to say about Iowa a while back is that it is a likely state where he currently leads by about 11%. The reason that I mix it up is because the reason where he actually leads by a safe margin, where it would be pretty unlikely in previous elections, is in Maine's second congressional district, where he does actually lead by over 15%. Looking at some of the states in which the margin is considered lean, and lean means between 2 to 5%. In that ballpark, we have Maine's at large 2 electoral votes. And so this has traditionally been a Democrat state, but in recent years, Trump has helped close that margin. Nonetheless, the current polling data shows it between 2 to 5%. In Virginia, right now, Biden does have a 4.9% lead. It is pretty close to the likely margin, but still in the lean column. And as I said before, in some of the other states, similarly in Virginia, the margin has increased for Democrats, especially has a lot of suburban voters have shifted away from Donald Trump in favor of Democratic candidates. And we can see that based on the voting over here in 2020. But to be fair, in this current polling data average, the margin of Biden's lead has decreased compared to 2020. Now, looking at the Sunbelt states, this is an area where polling data shows that Trump is significantly overperforming Biden. And these include a lot of swing states, or at least previously known to be swing states, that hold a large number of key electoral votes needed to get to 270. If we look at Florida, this has previously been considered one of the closest states, but in recent election seasons, it has shifted in favor of Republicans. And a lot of it has been due to Donald Trump. We've seen that a lot based on the extension the Republicans have had in 2016 and 2020, and then in 2022 in the midterms, the Republicans notably did well over here. And if we look at the margins, Trump is currently leading by 8% in the polling data. In Georgia, he's leading by 7.1%. Georgia was one of the closest states in the 2020 election and has 16 electoral votes. Previously was a pretty solid Republican state, but as the demographics have shifted over here and you've had an influx of Democratic voters from other states and for instance an increase in suburban voters trending towards the Democrats, it has gotten closer and closer for the Democratic side, and Biden actually won it in 2020. But now it's back in the Republican column based on the current polling averages. And in North Carolina, Trump leads by 8.2%. It was pretty close in 2020 and 2020 or 2016, but nonetheless, now his averages have increased compared to those previous two elections. Looking at Arizona, this has been one of the closest states in recent years. If we look at the 2016 election, Biden won it by 0.4%, and a lot of that is due to his numbers in Maricopa County in the Phoenix area, which allowed him to garner just enough votes to win that election. You can see the margin was extremely close. And if we look at 2016, Trump won here again by about 3.5%, something in that ballpark. And so recently, the margins for Republicans have diminished, and now the Democrats have already begun to win elections over here in a Senate level. So, for instance, the Democrats in 2022, they did pretty well here with Mark Kelly beating Blake Masters in the Senate election. So, again, the state has been trending towards the Democrats. A lot of that is due to the increase in suburban turnout for the Democrats around the Phoenix area, and also due to the increase in the Hispanic population in the states. And now, based on the polling averages, actually, the Republican Donald Trump is leading by 5.9%. So that is a pretty substantial shift compared to what he got in 2020. And it shows how generally he's been improving in a lot of these Sunbelt states in the southern parts of the US and also near the western coast. Looking at Nevada, Trump is currently leading here by 5.9%, which makes it a likely state. But as you can see in the previous elections, it was won by both Hillary Clinton and Joe Biden. But to be fair, during the 2022 election, although the Republicans did underperform in a lot of elections, one area where they did have a slightly better night was in Nevada, where they won the governor's election. But in the Senate election, it was pretty close, about an 8,000 vote margin. But the Democrats, Catherine Cortez Masto, did beat Laxalt. Either way, you could see how the state has been getting closer in some respects, despite changing demographics. Donald Trump does still maintain a pretty good lead when it comes to the polling average. And now we have the last three states to look at. These are the Rust Belt states. These are states that really did stun a lot of political pundits when they voted for Donald Trump in 2016. Because although these states were not necessarily safe Democrat states, they had consistently voted for Democrats for several decades before, although not by that large of a margin. Either way, it was a pretty big shift for Donald Trump to win it. And a lot of that is due to, again, blue collar workers switching from Democrat to Republican for the first time in their lives. And in the 2020 election, it was still close, but Biden was able to win back some of those voters or otherwise just win the votes in those certain elections. And as you can see, one area in which they were more in favor of Biden by a pretty small amount is Michigan, where you could see that he won by, 150,000 votes. It was still a pretty narrow margin, but it is an improvement from the Democrats' numbers in Michigan in 2016. And again, the Democrats also did good there in the midterm elections. And so in the current polling data, it suggests that Trump leads over here by 2.8%, which puts that state in the lean Donald Trump column, which is a good advantage for him to have because this is, again, 15 electoral votes and it's in one of the closest states out of the toss up. A state in which the vote margins were even closer in 2020 was Pennsylvania. As you can see over here, Trump only lost by 1.2%. And in 2016, he did win over here by 0.7%. And so this is also a state that Trump was able to flip over. Again, a lot of that is due to rural turnouts in the central part of the state and due to, pacifying the amount of power that the voters had in, Philadelphia and also around Pittsburgh. And so a lot of that is going to play a role in how Pennsylvania votes in 2024. Right now, as I said, Pennsylvania is Trump plus 7.75%, or sorry, 4.75%, which puts it in the lean Donald Trump column. And the last state we have to look at is Wisconsin. This state was in 2016 the most pro-Trump state in terms of the margin by which he won it in the Rust Belt. He won by 0.7%. And then in 2016 or 2020, Biden won the state by 0.6%, only by 20,000 votes. And a lot of that is due to running up the numbers in some of the urban areas. But either way, the state is still very contested. In the midterm elections, the Republican incumbent Ron Johnson did win the state by 1% against Mandela Barnes. And so there is still a significant Republican presence in the states. And what we see based on the polling data is that Trump is projected to win by 2.72%, making it the closest state out of all the polling averages we've seen so far. And that is really it because we don't have any information about Nebraska's 2nd Congressional District. This district does encompass the entire urban or broader Omaha metropolitan area in eastern Nevada. And in the 2020 election, it voted for Joe Biden by 6%. And so, just for the sake of argument, based on the trends we're seeing in the voting, it would likely shift in the 2024 election in the direction of Trump. Perhaps not enough to flip it over. So for now, we'll just leave it as a lean Biden state for the sake of having everything filled in. But just know there's no polling data for this specific section of the map. And so the final result based on the polling averages as of March 8th are former President Trump with 312 electoral votes and President Joe Biden with 226. This is not my own opinion. I just used the data that I have available from 538. And so that's all for today. Thank you for watching, and I'll see you guys in the next video.